Now this is kind of a weird story, but I think you'll enjoy it. Well, on April 24th, 1963, how many days after his attempt on Walker? 14. Ruth Payne, who's friends with Marina, goes to Oswald's apartment at 214 West Neely Street. So on April 24th, 1963, 14 days after this attempt on Walker, Ruth Payne decides to visit Marina at the Oswald's apartment, that 214 West Neely Street apartment. Yep. On April 24th, 1963, just 14 days after the attempt on Walker, Ruth Payne decides to go visit Marina at the Oswald apartment on 214 West Neely Street, that last one they moved into. What does she see when she gets there? Lee packed and ready to leave for New Orleans. She gets there and is surprised to see that Lee Harvey Oswald has packed his stuff and he's getting ready to leave to go to New Orleans. And what would be Mrs. Payne's first question? Why are you going to New Orleans, right? What do you think Oswald's answer was that he was going to New Orleans? This is before he worked where? Texas School Book Depository. Find a job. He couldn't find a job in Texas. So he told Mrs. Payne, well, I'm going to go to New Orleans and try to find a job. I can't find a job here or anywhere around Dallas. So I am going to go and find a job. Who really suggested to Lee that he go to New Orleans and find a job? Who supported that 100%? Why?
Because he was crazy.
Well, he once lived there, and she wanted to get, she later testified to the Warren Commission that she simply wanted to get him out of town. Why? Because of the Walker attempt. Okay, she was scared to death. So, on April 24th, 1963, Ruth Payne visits the Oswald's apartment. She's surprised to see that Lee is packed and ready to go to New Orleans. She asked Lee what he's going to New Orleans for. He said he's going there to try to find a job because he can't find one around that area. And also Marina suggested that he goes there because remember he used to live there and she thought maybe he'd have some ties and could get a job. And she wanted him the hell out of town, frankly. Okay? Well, Marina joined Lee in New Orleans on May 11th, 1963. So about 3 weeks later or so, she joins him in New Orleans. She joins him. She joins him. May 11th, 1963. She joins him. Now, they're living on unemployment benefits, and guess what Maria is again? Pregnant. Okay? So there they are in New Orleans. They're living off unemployment benefits because he hasn't found a job. And she's pregnant again. So it's not looking good for the poor Oswald family. Well, after looking for, finding, and losing various jobs in New Orleans, Oswald decides he's going to establish a pro-communist organization in New Orleans. So again, I'll repeat that. After looking for, finding, and losing various jobs in New Orleans, Oswald establishes a pro-communist organization in New Orleans. Okay, after looking for, finding, and losing various jobs in New Orleans, Oswald decides to establish a pro-communist organization in New Orleans. You're thinking this doesn't make any sense. Well, it probably doesn't. The name of this organization that he establishes is on your ID sheet, and it's called the Fair Play for Cuba campaign. The Fair Play for Cuba campaign. So, he looks for, he finds, he loses various jobs, and finally decides to establish an a pro-communist organization, which he calls the Fair Play for Cuba campaign. Now, believe it or not, this isn't a bogus deal. There are branch offices of this organization in various parts of the United States, there are people that have established these pro-communist organizations called the Fair Play for Cuba campaign. But there was not one where? In New Orleans. So that was in his mind. So are we short one?
No,
good?
not.
Got too many? Okay, just throw out the desk back or something. Anyway, so he establishes this Fair Play for Cuba campaign. There are branches of offices all over the country, but there's not in New Orleans. So you can see with this handout I gave you, this is a letter that he received, thanking him for supporting or doing that. There was actually a Communist Party USA group, and Arnold Johnson was the director. But anyway, there's his card. See his card to be a member? Lee H. Oswald, he signed it. (5/28/63) is what's on the date. Well, the weird thing about this is it had to have a president. Guess who Lee Harvey Oswald named president of the New Orleans branch of the Fair Play for Cuba? Himself. And guess how many members there were in New Orleans? One. Him. Okay? So he establishes this I'm not making this up, he establishes this pro-communist group. He names himself president, and he's the only member. Now, I don't know if you need to write this down or just listen, because it's a weird story. So he makes these pro-Castro flyers, these advertisements, and he goes all over the streets of New Orleans and he starts handing out these pro-Castro flyers. Well, what's going to eventually happen? Well, before that. Yeah, she's going to piss somebody off, which she did, because not everybody's pro-Castro in New Orleans, okay? So in August of '63, he gets in a fight with somebody about this and gets arrested. You're exactly right. And he's kind of a novelty because this is so weird. So if he's a novelty and he's the only man doing this in the city and he gets in a fight and gets arrested, who's interested in him? What? No, the news, the media. So he gets on a radio station, he gets on a television station, he does all kinds of interviews because they're interested in this guy. And he's loving it because this is his thing. Okay? So he's arrested in August 1963 for getting in a scuffle with an anti-Castro advocate. Because he's such a novelty, both radio stations and television stations do interviews with him. And he just kind of gets to be a big deal in his mind because he's doing this. Well, here's where you got to kind of maybe start writing it. In September of 1963, Oswald tells Marina that he's going to travel to both Mexico City and Cuba. He tells her in September of '63, 2 months before the assassination, he tells her in New Orleans that he has a plan to travel to both Mexico City and Cuba. Now it even gets weirder because when she gave her testimony to the Warren Commission, she also told the Warren Commission that Lee wanted her to help him hijack an airplane to Cuba. But she talked him out of it. That was her testimony in the front of the Warren Commission after the assassination. She told the Warren Commission that Lee told her he was going to Mexico City, then to Cuba, and wanted her to help him hijack an airplane to Cuba. And she talked him out of it. Isn't that crazy? I mean, well, about that same time, guess who comes to visit Marina in New Orleans? Mrs. Payne. And she can see that Marina's pregnant. She can see that she doesn't have any medical care. They have no money. She feels sorry for her. So what does she do on September 23rd, 1963? What?
Offers to take her back.
Actually, yes, takes her back. And this is when she starts living with Mrs. Payne. Okay? So I'll repeat it. Shortly after this time that Lee Harvey Oswald tries to talk Marina into hijacking a plane to Cuba, Mrs. Payne shows up in September of '63. And she took a look at Marina and thought, oh my God, she's pregnant again, they got no money, she's not getting proper medical care. And so she offers and Marina accepts. And on September 23rd of 1963, Mrs. Payne brings Marina back to Irving, Texas, where she lives, and this is when Marina first starts living with Mrs. Payne. That sets up this story. Okay? She was 8 months pregnant at this time and had never received any prenatal care, never been to the doctor. And she was 8 months pregnant. And Mrs. Payne thought, this is bad, I'll take her back, Lee can do his own thing. This would be the last time that Lee Oswald and Maureen Oswald ever lived together. You know the rest of the story on that. Anyway, it was on September 23rd, 1963 when Marina returned to Dallas with Mrs. Payne, and she moved her in with her at Irving. Okay, she was 8 months pregnant, had received no prenatal care whatsoever for the baby, and this would be the last time the Oswalds would live together. So there's Oswald. What does he do? He obtains what's called a tourist card from the Mexican Consulate General in New Orleans, and it's good for one trip to Mexico for no longer than 15 days. So he goes to the Mexican embassy in New Orleans, and he obtains a tourist card, which is good for one trip into Mexico for no longer than 15 days. So Marina's gone back, he goes to the Mexican embassy and gets a tourist card, which is good for one trip into Mexico for no longer than 15 days. Now this kind of makes my point on that possible, what I think happened. On September 25th, 1963, just 2 days after his wife left, Oswald indeed traveled to Mexico, and where did he go? Mexico City. And he visited both the Cuban and Russian embassies there. Now you remember, James Hosty was concerned that he met with who down there? An assassin, right, remember that? So who knows? But he was concerned. So on September 25th, 1963, just 2 days after Marina went back with Ruth Payne, Oswald did travel to Mexico City on that tourist visa, tourist card, and he visited both the Cuban and Russian embassies there. And what was his goal when he visited them? What did he want from them? A visa to either go to Cuba or Russia, whoever would let him go there. Both embassies denied him. Both embassies denied him. So on October 3rd of 1963, Oswald returned to Texas. On October 3rd, 1963, he returns to Texas. And where does he go? Where does he move into?
Boarding house.
The boarding house, which we'll talk about how he registered for all that. Because you think he registered under Lee Harvey Oswald, that boarding house? What did he register under? You might think A.J. Heidel. He actually, O.H. Lee. O.H. Lee. Lee Harvey, however you want to look at it.
that's what I signed.
Yeah. Yep. So anyway, we'll continue that tomorrow, okay? And thanks again for the wonderful, God, I just can't believe it. This is serious. Yeah.
What was the date when Oswald got to the fight? August?